All right, guys, and welcome to Robostoph's Top 5 Sci-Fi Book Recommendations. Something to know about me as a reader is I like to read old books, and I like to read books that are culturally significant in some way. So I don't read a lot of new stuff, and I never have. It's just never been what's interested me. So with that being said, unfortunately, it's hard for me to give people book recommendations that are current or up to date. Nothing wrong with people that are reading all the trendy new stuff that comes out. New authors got to make a living, and they have to have a fan base, and I respect that. But me, my interests are like I said, dated. So the books that are on this list aren't anything surprising. They're pretty much staples in their genre. But for me, they launched other things, right? Like it didn't just stand alone as being, oh, this is just a good book and I liked it. No, this is a book that had an impact on a movie franchise, or it was a pop culture phenomenon, or it was controversial in some way. So that's kind of where my mind is headed with these recommendations. So we're going to start off with number one, which is not just my top sci-fi book recommendation, but my all-time book recommendation, which is George Orwell's 1984. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Many may argue that this isn't really truly sci-fi, but to me, it is. That's my argument. And it also sort of inspired a lot of other writers that would come after and sort of created this dystopian subgenre and turned it into what we know it to be today. It is not the first dystopian novel. There are other examples of people writing this type of fiction before George Orwell. A great example of that would be We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This book right here, which I would also recommend, served as somewhat of a prototype for George Orwell by his own admission, okay? And it's a template. But despite that, whether or not George Orwell was the first person to the punch on this one, his book launched just this wave, right? Like, we still describe stuff as being Orwellian, or that's very 1984. And it is that thought alone that inspired me to pick up that book in the first place, because I oftentimes go, oh, wow, that's so 1984. And that's very Orwellian. And I had realized that I've never read the book. So, but I realized I was being kind of a hypocrite. I picked it up. And I picked it up knowing only our pop culture references to it, not really knowing anything about it. And it had a profound impact on me. The actual story is very compelling. It can be dry at points, so if that's not your thing, come back to this one when you're in the right headspace. But there's some gut-wrenching elements to this book. And it's well known, but the characters in it, they're going through a struggle, and they kind of sell themselves out. And that's what makes it hurt, right? Because you're rooting for the hero, and with as little spoilers as possible, they don't win. And they don't just not win. They sell themselves out, and they go out without dignity, and that's where they don't die the hero. It's sad, but also it launched this whole other wave of fiction, and some of my favorite books that would come after it. Like, you probably wouldn't have Android's Dream of Electric Sheep or Harry Harrison's Make Room, Make Room if you didn't have George Orwell's 1984, whether that directly influenced those authors or not. The next book on my list is Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulet. Planet of the Apes. A lot of people don't even know that this movie franchise started with a novel. And it's one of my favorite movie franchises of all time. And when I found out that it was, based on this novel, I was like, oh, I gotta check it out. And it's weird to me that of all the entries into the Planet of the Apes franchise, this is probably the least talked about of them, right? Unless, like, people either have read this book and it's just, or they watch the movies, but they're very, very rarely do these seem to cross paths for some reason. It is very much very similar to the movie, the very first one from the 60s with Charlton Heston, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. Very similar. There's some key differences, right? So it's still worth going back and reading the book that started it all. And I also like it because it's a standalone. Like, this is just a one-off. And the author really wasn't a sci-fi writer. Like, sci-fi stuff was not his thing. But he wrote this book, and then that was it. And he didn't try to make a bunch of sequels. It said what it needed to say, which is what I like about it. It's a one-shot kind of deal. And somehow this awesome idea just spawned all these movies that they're still making. It's crazy, and I'm about to watch the first or the newest one this weekend. I mean, that's how big this book's impact is, and it's just kind of sad and unfortunate to me that people don't even know that's where it came from, because it's actually a really good book. So if you're a Planet of the Apes junkie and you want to see how it all started and you haven't read this one yet, definitely check this one out. It does bother me, though, that this has like the Tim Burton movie cover on it, but whatever. I like that movie too. Hate me for it. Alrighty, next on the list is Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. This is the book that inspired the movie The Thing, which is directed by John Carpenter. And if you've seen the movie, then you're familiar with the template of the book here. But this is probably one of the most significant entries into the, paranoia genres, right? Where who's an alien? Who amongst us is who they say they are? Some of that like McCarthyism, everybody's a communist paranoia stuff. And I don't know if that influenced the author in any way when he wrote this one, but that's kind of the vibe you get. Everybody's your enemy. You don't know who's really the good guy. Who amongst us is a Russian spy? I don't know. But instead of it being a Russian spy, it's aliens, right? And again, it's responsible for one of my all-time favorite movies, which is The Thing, the Kurt Russell version. Obviously, one of the best special effects movies of all time. But despite its significance, this is a quick read. It's not very long, and I like that this is a book that you can read. I read it in one sitting, but you can, one or two sittings, and it just moves so fast, and it's compelling. It's more of a novella, I guess. But it's a gripping tale as well, and I wouldn't even say that it's dated. Many of the people who criticize this say that it's outdated, but to me, stands up to me. So, alrighty, the next one on the list is Communion by Whitley Strieber. This is one of my least favorite books, so you may be wondering, how could it enter my top 5 sci-fi book recommendations? And you may also be wondering, but how could a true story be on a sci-fi book recommendation list? Because it's not. That's the answer. It's not a true story. And it's a very bad story. But it's on my list because of its cultural significance, right? It is not the first of its kind. This is not the first guy to say that he was abducted by aliens, and here's my testimony. This is just a book. And it was super popular, and credit to the author for getting lightning in a bottle here. But it's sort of like the Blair Witch of its time, right? Where people are scratching their heads trying to figure out, is this true? Is this guy is he being dead ass? And yeah, I think if he's still around doing this, and I think if you follow him, he is, convinced. I actually believe that. I don't think that he thinks he's lying, which makes it even more fascinating. But he wrote a number of horror books and things like that before this, so he's a creatively minded individual. So it's not like he just came out of nowhere with a true story about how he was abducted by aliens. No, he's an author, he's a writer, creative individual. And I don't know if that gives his testimony more credence or less, but because of the impact that this book had, that's why it's on my recommendations. It is hard to get through, and I didn't enjoy it. But I did enjoy the rabbit holes that it sent me down. I started looking into all these other topics and all these other categories. It's like, okay, well, where did this come from? And you find out about this guy named Bud Hopkins in this book. It's the guy who hypnotized the author, right? And Bud Hopkins wrote a number of books before Communion that were about people being hypnotized and then, retelling their abduction stories through, their repressed memories and stuff. And it's a whole big thing, but it's bad, but it's also good, but not good bad. I don't know. Check it out. Alrighty, and my last of the top 5 is Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. This is one of my all-time favorite books because as a military veteran, it speaks to me in a way that no other military fiction has spoken to me. this book is often criticized as being military propaganda. It is kind of, I guess, because it seems to be so fond of the military experience. But one thing I can say about, speaking from somebody who's been in the military, is you do look back on some of the hardest things that you ever went through with a certain sense of fondness in retrospect, right? Like boot camp sucked while I was there. I had fun, but it sucked while I was there. But now, almost 15 years later, I kind of look back on it like, yeah, kind of miss my dudes, I kind of miss the people I talked to and the camaraderie that we shared over these experiences. And then, of course, after that as well, the people that I worked with on a day-to-day basis were excellent people, and I made friendships that, you know, still have a profound impact on me all these years later, and people I still talk to all these years later. But with that aside, at its core, this is also a good story. It reads like a autobiography of a fictional soldier who works his way from the bottom to the top in the midst of a intergalactic bug war. So it's an interesting story as well. It's not quite as action-packed as the movie version, which is sort of a parody of this book, or a kind of a criticism of military propaganda, I guess you could say. A satire, that's what I'm looking for. But it is awesome, though. Like, they get mech suits, which is an element that's missing from the movies. And the mech suits, this may be one of the earliest versions of mech suits, and it launched a whole thing in Japan. So, about, people's fascinations with mech suits. This is right around that same time. And to this day, this story is very popular in Japan because of the mech suits. And inspired such stories as like All You Need Is Kill, which is very popular over there. So I just always thought that was kind of cool that it's like this. You never know who your books are going to inspire or whatever. And on the other side of the world, this book is really popular over there. So definitely check this one out if you're into military fiction at all. It's also on the required military reading list, and once you start reading it, you'll find out why. Because it's just very authentic. That's what I think I enjoy the most about it. It's an authentic experience from an author that had that experience and remembers it in much the same way a lot of us do. And even though I can heavily criticize the military-industrial complex and what it stands for overall, and the travesty of sending people to war and all this stuff into combat, it doesn't change that at its core, those people individually who are in those situations are experiencing something together and building relationships, and I think this book captured that expertly. All right, honorable mention. This one is on the list because it's one of my all-time favorites, which is Their Master's War by Mick Farren. This is an obscure book. It's just like if you're in any random bookstore, you might find it. And I picked it up a long time ago as a teenager, and it just hit all my like personal, fantasy check marks, right? Like you have these soldiers who are abducted while they were cavemen. So, like, these ancient human beings are abducted by aliens, and they're trained to fight in their master's war. And, of course, they have, like, a rebellion, because this isn't their war. Screw your alien overlords. And they get these cool suits that are, like, they have a symbiotic relationship with their suits, and, so they're, like, enhanced super soldiers and stuff. And whenever I'm looking at my bookshelf and I'm just looking at all the books that I've read, and every time I kind of gaze by this one, I'm just like, that was a fun book. So I recommend it because it's obscure and it's just good old-fashioned sci-fi. And as a teenager, I loved it, and I look forward to the day where I read it again. But it'll be a while because my TBR is forever growing and it's not getting any smaller. But maybe I'll carve out time for this little favorite of mine. All right, guys. So that was my top 5 book recommendations for sci-fi. Just kind of ad-lib the whole thing, so I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any commentary you'd like to provide or add in the comments down below, please do. I'd love to argue with you about stuff. So with that being said, like, subscribe, whatever, and be well.